Marcus stepped out of his car, eyes scanning the street lined with immaculate brownstones. He had always dreamed of living in a place like this, where history and architecture blended seamlessly with the modern world. It was the perfect spot for his family, close enough to the city for work, but far enough for his daughter to play in peace. He approached the building he had been eyeing for months. Its faded grandeur caught his eye, the kind of place that could be brought back to life with the right touch. He smiled, imagining his family living here, creating memories that would last a lifetime. The door opened before he could knock. A man in his 60s wearing a pressed shirt and a sour expression stood in the doorway. "You're here about the apartment?" the man asked without introduction. Marcus nodded. "Yes, I spoke with you on the phone. Marcus Bennett." He extended his hand, but the man, whose name was Walter according to the paperwork, made no move to shake it. Walter's eyes flicked over Marcus, assessing him with a coldness that made the hair on the back of Marcus's neck stand up. It was subtle at first, the way Walter's lips pressed into a thin line, the slight narrowing of his eyes, but Marcus had felt it enough times in his life to recognize it for what it was. "I'm sorry," Walter said after a pause, stepping back. "The apartment's been rented already." Marcus blinked, confused. "But you said it was still available on the phone. I even have the deposit ready." Walter's gaze didn't waver. "It was a mistake. I must have misremembered. Good day." The door slammed shut before Marcus could respond. He stood there for a moment, fists clenched at his sides, trying to calm the anger bubbling inside him. He knew what had just happened. The subtle racism, the dismissiveness, it wasn't new, but it stung just the same. Turning away from the door, Marcus made his way back to the car. He could have left it at that. He could have walked away, found another place, and let the bitterness of this moment fade. But as he sat in his car, staring at the brownstone, a thought crossed his mind. Why should I walk away? Why should I let someone like him dictate where my family lives? A slow smile spread across Marcus's face. He pulled out his phone, opening his banking app. It was time to do something bold, something unexpected. If Walter didn't want him as a tenant, then Marcus would buy the entire building, and that was just the beginning. Marcus drove away from the neighborhood, but his mind was spinning with ideas. He knew it would take some time to put everything in motion, but the more he thought about it, the more determined he became. Walter had refused him based on skin color, an outdated, hateful prejudice that had no place in the world Marcus was building for his family. When he returned home, Marcus shared his experience with his wife, Lena. She listened, her brow furrowed with concern, but a smile slowly crept across her face when Marcus explained his plan. "You're really going to buy the whole building?" she asked, half in disbelief. "Why not?" Marcus replied, his tone light but resolute. "If I can't rent from him, I'll just take ownership. We've been saving for this kind of opportunity." Lena nodded, her smile growing. She admired Marcus's ambition and his refusal to let small-minded people dictate their lives. She had no doubts about him pulling this off. Over the next few weeks, Marcus worked quietly behind the scenes, consulting with lawyers, real estate agents, and financiers. As a successful architect, he had built connections over the years, and now those connections were about to help him pull off something incredible. Meanwhile, Walter remained unaware of Marcus's plans. He continued maintaining his building, refusing prospective tenants who didn't fit his narrow view of who should live there. He was starting to feel the financial strain, though. Years of relying on the prestige of the neighborhood to keep the value of his property high had left him complacent. He hadn't bothered keeping up with repairs, and several tenants had quietly moved out, tired of his controlling behavior. Then came the offer. Walter opened the thick envelope one evening, sitting in his cluttered study. He hadn't seen it coming, and the sight of Marcus's name on the purchase contract was enough to make him drop his drink. "This can't be real," he muttered to himself, but it was. The offer was legitimate, and it came with a price Walter couldn't ignore, more money than he had ever expected to get for the building. At first, Walter bristled at the thought of selling his building to Marcus. The idea of a black family owning property in his neighborhood was an affront to everything he believed in. But as the days passed and his financial situation became more precarious, he realized he had little choice. The suspense builds as Walter wrestles with his decision. He knows that selling would mean the end of the control he's held over the property for years. But he also knows that turning down the offer would leave him with mounting debt and a crumbling building that no longer brought in enough rent to sustain him. After a sleepless night, Walter made his decision. With a trembling hand, he signed the contract. Marcus's plan was officially in motion. The news spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Marcus Bennett, the man Walter had once dismissed without a second thought, was now the new owner of one of the most desirable brownstones in the area. The neighborhood, predominantly white and filled with old money families, was thrown into a quiet uproar. Rumors began circulating almost immediately. Who was this man? What were his plans for the building? Some residents feared that Marcus would lower the value of their properties, while others whispered about the type of people he would bring into their precious neighborhood. But Marcus didn't rush to reveal his plans. He worked quietly, making necessary repairs and upgrading the building's infrastructure. To the casual observer, it looked like any other renovation project. But to those paying attention, there was an undercurrent of something more. A month later, Marcus and his family moved in. It was a sunny Saturday morning when they arrived, and Marcus made sure the move was unassuming. He wasn't interested in causing a scene, but that didn't stop the neighbors from watching from behind their curtains, their faces filled with suspicion. Lena, who had grown used to these subtle forms of racism, ignored the stares and focused on helping their daughter, Naomi, get settled in her new room. Marcus, on the other hand, couldn't help but notice the neighbor's icy demeanor, but instead of feeling discouraged, he felt energized. He knew he was doing something significant, something that could change the course of this neighborhood. As the days passed, Marcus and Lena became accustomed to their new surroundings, though it was clear that the other residents were keeping their distance. Invitations to neighborhood events didn't come their way, and the few neighbors who did greet them did so with forced politeness. The tension simmered just beneath the surface, but Marcus knew it would boil over soon enough. Marcus had more in mind for the building than just making it a home for his family. He had a vision that extended far beyond the four walls of his brownstone, and he was about to put it into action. A few weeks after settling in, Marcus announced that part of the building's ground floor would be converted into a community center. His goal was to provide resources for underprivileged youth from the city, mentoring programs, after-school activities, and workshops designed to give kids the tools they needed to succeed. The announcement shook the neighborhood to its core. The whispers turned into outright gossip, and within days, Marcus found himself the subject of hushed conversations at every local cafe and shop. The idea of opening the neighborhood to children from outside their carefully curated bubble was unthinkable to many. Walter, who had been stewing since the sale, took it upon himself to lead the opposition. He began calling on his neighbors, urging them to block Marcus's plans. "He's going to ruin this place," Walter warned. "Once that center opens, we'll be flooded with outsiders. Our property values will plummet." But Marcus was prepared. He held a public meeting in the brownstone's grand foyer, inviting the entire neighborhood to hear him out. The room was filled with tense faces, and Walter sat in the back, arms crossed, scowling. Marcus, calm and confident, laid out his vision. He explained how the community center would operate, who it would serve, and how it could benefit not only the kids, but also the neighborhood. He spoke with passion and purpose, describing the impact such a program could have on young lives. But despite his eloquence, the reception was cold. Suspense built as the neighbors murmured their discontent, and Walter's voice cut through the noise. "We didn't move here to have our neighborhood turned into a charity case," he spat, earning nods from several others. Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "You didn't move here to make a difference," he said, his voice steady. "But I did, and I'm not asking for your permission. I'm letting you know what's coming." The tension in the room was palpable. Walter stood abruptly, storming out of the meeting, his face flushed with anger. Marcus watched him go, knowing that this was only the beginning of the fight. In the weeks following Marcus's announcement, the neighborhood became a battleground of subtle and overt tensions. The whispers had evolved into active resistance, and at the center of it all stood Walter. He had become the self-appointed leader of a group determined to stop Marcus's plans from taking root. These weren't just neighbors concerned about property values anymore. This was a coordinated effort to push Marcus and his family out. Flyers began circulating, warning of the dangers the community center would bring: unruly kids, crime, and the inevitable decline of their safe neighborhood. A petition was passed around to block the construction, and complaints were filed with the city, alleging that Marcus's renovations were illegal. But none of it slowed Marcus down. He stayed the course, quietly overseeing the renovations and securing permits, all while keeping his family out of the growing chaos. Lena, who had faced her share of racism before, tried to stay positive, though she couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. One night, while Marcus worked late on the building's plans, he heard a loud crash outside. He rushed to the window and saw that one of the front windows of the brownstone had been smashed in. Spray-painted across the building's front was a crude message: "Go back to where you came from." The sight of it caused a chill to run down Marcus's spine. This was no longer just passive resistance. The neighborhood had crossed a line. Lena came down the stairs, alarmed by the noise. When she saw the graffiti, her face paled. "We have to do something, Marcus. This is getting dangerous." Marcus clenched his fists, staring at the vandalism. "I know, but if we leave now, they win." Instead of backing down, Marcus doubled his efforts. He reported the vandalism to the police, though he knew there was little they could or would do. The next day, Marcus hired a crew to clean the graffiti and replace the window, sending a clear message: they would not be intimidated. But the attacks continued. Suspense built as small acts of sabotage plagued the construction. Tools went missing, permits were mysteriously delayed, and contractors reported being harassed by anonymous phone calls. Walter, though not directly responsible, reveled in the growing chaos. He had successfully rallied a large portion of the neighborhood, and the tension reached a boiling point. A meeting was called at Walter's house, where the most vocal residents gathered to discuss what they called the Marcus problem. "This community is being destroyed from the inside out," Walter declared to the group. "We've worked too hard to let this happen. We need to step up our efforts. If the city won't stop him, we will." Thrills escalate as the group begins planning more organized ways to undermine Marcus, unaware that he has already anticipated their next moves. The acts of sabotage continued, but Marcus remained calm and methodical in his response. He wasn't going to let the pressure shake him. Yet, tensions were high at home. Lena worried constantly about their daughter, Naomi, who had started hearing whispers at school from classmates repeating their parents' prejudices. One evening, after yet another incident of vandalism at the construction site, Marcus finally confronted Walter directly. He found him at the neighborhood park, watching from a distance as kids played nearby. Walter's smug expression didn't waver when Marcus approached, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear, perhaps. "You think this is going to work?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but firm. "You think you can scare us off?" Walter shrugged, still refusing to meet Marcus's eyes. "You don't belong here. Neither does that center. This is a place for people like us. You're only going to bring trouble." The tension between them was palpable, and the park felt eerily quiet as Marcus held Walter's gaze. "You're afraid," Marcus said after a long pause. "Afraid of losing control. But you can't stop change. I'm not going anywhere, and the center is going to open, whether you like it or not." Walter's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "I've built this neighborhood. I know what's best for it." "You built it for yourself," Marcus replied. "But that's not how communities grow. You can try to stop me, but in the end, you're fighting a losing battle. The world is moving forward, with or without you." The confrontation ended without violence, but Marcus's words lingered long after he walked away. Walter's once unshakable confidence was beginning to crack. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that Marcus wasn't just another tenant he could push out. He was a force Walter hadn't reckoned with. In the days following Marcus's confrontation with Walter, a quiet but profound shift began to take place in the neighborhood. Not everyone agreed with Walter's extreme measures, and slowly, cracks in the community's resistance started to show. The turning point came when Eleanor, a longtime resident in her 70s, reached out to Marcus. Eleanor had lived in the neighborhood for over 40 years, watching it change, but she had grown disillusioned with the attitudes of her fellow residents. She had seen prejudice take root in subtle ways over the years, but she had always kept her head down, too afraid to speak out. Now, she had had enough. Eleanor knocked on Marcus's door one afternoon, introducing herself with a warm smile. "I've lived here for a long time," she said, "and I've seen a lot of things change. I think what you're doing is important, Marcus. I'd like to help." Marcus was taken aback by her kindness but welcomed her support. Eleanor's involvement brought a new energy to the project. She began speaking out against the prejudice she had once tolerated, encouraging others to see the value in Marcus's vision. Slowly but surely, a small group of residents started to come around, recognizing the good that the community center could bring. Thrills build as Eleanor's quiet influence spreads. The tides are turning, but the battle is far from over. The grand opening of the community center was approaching, and despite the growing support, Walter and his group were still intent on stopping it. They ramped up their efforts, pushing harder to get the city to shut it down. Legal challenges, zoning complaints, and even false accusations of code violations were thrown at Marcus, but he was prepared. On the day of the center's opening, the neighborhood was buzzing with tension. Marcus stood at the entrance watching as families from all over the city began arriving, excited to be part of something positive. Eleanor was by his side, greeting guests with a smile. But in the distance, Marcus spotted Walter and a few of his staunchest supporters. They were watching from the sidelines, arms crossed, their faces twisted with frustration. For a moment, Marcus wondered if they would cause a scene, but instead they stood silently, seething as the celebration carried on. The community center opened without a hitch, marking a victory for Marcus and a turning point for the neighborhood. As people from all walks of life mingled, participated in workshops, and watched their children play, it became clear that the change Marcus had fought for was becoming a reality. Walter sat in his darkened living room, staring at the photos of his once pristine neighborhood. Pictures of past events, block parties, and gatherings filled with faces he recognized, people like him. They were from a time when things were right, when there was no question about who belonged. But now, everything felt out of his control. Marcus's community center had opened, and people from outside the neighborhood were flooding in. The sound of children playing, cars driving through the streets, and laughter filled the air every day. He couldn't stand it. As weeks passed, Walter's frustration turned to obsession. He spent his days fixated on how to get rid of Marcus and close the community center. His actions grew more desperate. He tried filing more complaints, harassing city officials, and even pressuring his old friends to join his cause, but the results were the same. The city dismissed his complaints one by one, each met with Marcus's airtight legal work and spotless permits. Behind Walter's closed doors, something darker was unfolding. His financial situation, hidden from the world for so long, was finally catching up with him. The building he once owned had been his primary source of income, and after selling it to Marcus, his debts were spiraling out of control. The pressure of keeping up appearances while battling Marcus had drained his savings, leaving him on the verge of bankruptcy. One evening, as Walter sat in his kitchen, the weight of everything came crashing down on him. Letters from creditors piled high on the table, his phone buzzed with calls he refused to answer, and his hands trembled as he poured himself a drink. The once proud and arrogant man was unraveling, his life teetering on the edge. The final blow came when one of his old friends, who had once supported him unconditionally, cut ties. "I can't keep doing this, Walter. This fight isn't worth it anymore. You're only hurting yourself." Walter's world collapsed around him. The very people who had once rallied to his cause were abandoning him, leaving him alone in his bitterness and failure. Unable to bear his downfall, Walter made one last desperate attempt to sabotage Marcus. In the dead of night, Walter, consumed by anger and fear, snuck onto the property, intending to vandalize the community center in an effort to get it shut down. His hands shook as he approached the building, spray can in hand, ready to deface the walls with hateful messages. But before he could start, a spotlight from the property flicked on, illuminating the scene. Startled, Walter turned to find Marcus standing at the door, arms crossed, watching him. The two men stood in silence for a moment, the tension thick in the air. Walter's face twisted in a mixture of guilt and anger as he realized he had been caught. "What are you doing, Walter?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but firm. Walter's hand, still clutching the spray can, trembled. I just wanted," he faltered, unable to find the words. He felt small, exposed, as though all his hatred and prejudice had been laid bare before him. He had no more excuses. "This isn't who you are," Marcus continued, taking a step closer. "You don't have to keep doing this. You've lost everything because of your pride. It's time to stop." Walter's shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. He had nothing left, not his building, not his status, not even the respect of his neighbors. For the first time, he felt defeated in a way that went beyond financial loss. It was personal. The world he had tried so hard to control had moved on without him. "What do you want from me?" Walter whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't want anything from you," Marcus replied. "I just want to move forward. We don't have to keep fighting." Walter stood there, paralyzed by his own emotions, before dropping the spray can to the ground. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. It was the last time Marcus would see Walter in the neighborhood. In the months following Walter's final defeat, the neighborhood underwent a remarkable transformation. The community center had become a beacon of hope for families all over the city. Marcus's programs had taken off, attracting volunteers, donations, and local support. Children who once had no safe place to go after school now had a second home, and the center offered tutoring, sports, and mentorship that changed the lives of countless young people. Eleanor continued to be one of Marcus's strongest allies, bringing more longtime residents into the fold. The initial resistance to the center faded as people saw the positive impact it was having, not just on the neighborhood, but on the city as a whole. Slowly, those who had once been staunch opponents like Eleanor began to see the value in what Marcus had built. The tensions that had once divided the neighborhood began to dissolve, replaced by a new sense of community and purpose. People who had never spoken to one another were now collaborating on events, attending workshops, and engaging in the kind of open dialogue that had once seemed impossible. Marcus and Lena were now not just residents but respected leaders in the community. On a quiet afternoon, Marcus stood outside the community center, watching as children played in the courtyard, their laughter filling the air. Lena joined him, resting her head on his shoulder, proud of all they had accomplished. "You did it," she said softly, smiling up at him. Marcus shook his head. "We did it. This was always about more than just us." Their daughter, Naomi, ran over, grinning as she showed them a drawing she had made at the center. It was of their family, standing in front of their brownstone, surrounded by the community they had helped to heal. Walter, having sold off his remaining properties, had moved to a quieter part of the city. His financial troubles were far from over, but he had found a small measure of peace in his solitude. He no longer had the power or influence he once held, but in the quiet moments he reflected on his actions and the life he had led. One day, he received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Marcus. Inside was a simple note. "The community center is always open to you. No matter what happened between us, you are welcome to be part of what we've built." Walter stared at the letter for a long time, unsure of how to feel. It was an olive branch, an opportunity to heal the wounds of the past. He wasn't sure if he had the courage to take it, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than anger and resentment. He felt the faint stirrings of hope. Years later, the community center had grown into one of the most successful programs in the city. It had expanded, offering scholarships, job training, and a network of resources that helped countless families. Marcus's vision had become a reality, and it was far greater than even he had imagined. As Marcus looked back on everything they had accomplished, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride, not just for what they had built, but for how far they had come as a community. Walter never did return to the neighborhood, but his legacy, once filled with division and prejudice, had been replaced by something far more powerful, a legacy of unity, compassion, and progress. Marcus stood outside the community center one last time, watching as the sun set over the neighborhood he now called home. It was a place where people from all backgrounds lived together, worked together, and supported one another. "We did it," Marcus whispered to himself, smiling as the lights of the community center flickered on, guiding the way for future generations. The story of racist landlord refuses black tenant, but what he does after shocks the entire neighborhood is one of transformation, perseverance, and redemption. Marcus's journey, from being rejected by a prejudiced landlord to becoming a pillar of his community, shows the power of determination and kindness in the face of adversity. Walter, though consumed by his own fears and prejudices, eventually finds a small path to redemption, highlighting that change is possible for even the most resistant individuals. This narrative serves as a reminder that progress, though often slow and met with resistance, is inevitable. And in the end, it is those who embrace change and strive for unity who leave behind the most lasting legacies. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more stories of hope, redemption, and unexpected triumphs. Every act of change starts with a single step. Join us as we explore stories that show the impact one person can have on the world. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.